I want to invite somebody from each group. So to give like, is there a new thought, an insight, a comment you wanted to make? The key thought that came up in your discussion.
Yes, we talked about complexity in the city, and we had Gerard van de Zeeuw in our group, and he unraveled everything with one strong sentence. Deconstructed. The complexity in the city is often about not knowing, or not knowing that it's not knowing what to do, and not knowing that it's not complex at all. When you are there in the back, you added something here. Not knowing things is related to your reference base of knowledge, values, and the cultural experience. Something is complex if it doesn't fit in your reference base.
For me was something fascinating is this idea of planning God in the game, when you can destroy a city or build it, and actually the experience of the agency in that. So in this role, in this experience, was really super interesting.
Yeah, at the end we were basically talking about the role of design, and one of the interesting things is that, for example, 10, 15 years ago, you were a designer, was a very specific position to be in, and now it seems that design is part of any practice. And this causes some confusion sometimes, and it was something that we talked about. It was quite an interesting conversation.
We reflected on urban experience, where we first thought, what is actually an urban experience? Where the first shortest insight was, well, having a regular bus schedule means in having an urban experience. But then we also then, I think, living in the city is, I think, actually part of Caroline's n-dimensional and dimensional model, because I think, like time goes by, also for quite many people, that's inevitable. Also, living in cities is inevitable for many people. So it's just a given that you live in cities. And then our discussion moved in a direction of developing commons, where actually more and more things are moving into, looking into how can we actually create commons in cities where we actually share spaces and work together. Where we discussed quite a lot of things where commons can be established and bikes, and the formal and informal rules of cyclists are providing a wealth of experiences to develop from. So that if you give us a hand.
So I'll just summarize the conversation. We started with discussing about clashes, contradictions, tensions that the rhythms can create. So the rhythms can also be detrimental, they can be superimposed, and we can all have different difficulties in adapting. But on the same time, this adaptation can also create tuning within. So there is a contradiction there, which we didn't have a solution for it, but it was nice to talk about. And then we moved on to geography of time, which was mentioned by Scott beforehand, so we had questions about that. And then we ended up with the question, how can actually cities extend? How does this time factor work in connectivity or in non-connectivity? And how does it affect our psychology of looking at the city? And then our conversation moved on to information and daily experiences, which was, by Paola, it was mentioned that it was one of the first concerns of the sociology was the speed of the metropolis and how to deal with this big bombardment of information, so how to give a shape to that. And that's why also we had a lot of, in urban sociology especially, there are a lot of sociologists who reflected on, or urbanists reflected on analyzing urban rhythms, not in relation or not in relation to each other. And then reflecting on rhythm as variation in a pattern, we ended up with a very interesting conclusive question, which was, yes, that we always, when we discuss about variation and patterns, we discuss in terms of time, so a pattern that, and then the next pattern that comes in. But maybe the non-variation or the not having the next pattern can also be an indication of a rhythm. So, for example, we're talking about seasons. Yes, you see the seasonal change, but then not being able to see the seasonal change can also be an indication of the rhythm happening. So I will conclude with this. Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, we started with a discussion around beauty as harmony, something that can harmonize and bring together. It's neutral.
Yeah.
And we can all have our way of entering and being part of this discussion around the beauty.
Yeah. And the beautiful part is that it's within beauty. It's a bit harder, louder. The thing about beauty is subjective as well. So it's a way of connecting, but it's a way of it can disconnect, and that there's a rhythm in it as well.
Yes.
And so then we started talking about structures and character structures. There are about when you reflect on othering and yourself as a person. Some people are we people. They
Naturally will.
Yeah,
yes.
they naturally look for collaborations or connecting. And how do you interact with people who are different in their structure? And then we were discussing those different aspects regarding that.
Yes, and we, I think we had some wonderful examples, didn't we, of where how to create co-authoring when there is conflict or difference or refusal to accept the other.
Yeah.
Could be cultural, racial, all sorts of reasons, economic. And there was a lovely example where...
Yeah, Fatana.
Where is she, Fatana?
Please come.
Very, very briefly, just in a nutshell. I think
it's really hard.
It's hard in a nutshell.
Sure. So I told a story. Well, there was an example given by someone else about acceptance and we were talking about Wilders. What should we do? Should we go in defense, or how can we make him more accepting towards other people? And that reminded me of an example early in my life when I came to the Netherlands for the first time. I was 7. And I was placed with my family in a neighborhood where we were the only non-Dutch people there learning the language. And from the start, we noticed that the neighborhood wasn't really accepting towards us. Instead, I heard through a friend of mine that the entire neighborhood started an informal committee to get rid of us from the neighborhood. And they came together every week to start trying to keep track of us if we did anything wrong, so they could write it all down on a paper and then give it to the municipality to get rid of us from the neighborhood. And we were just a family, kids, my parents. As a kid, I didn't really understand why people would do that. You know, I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to get to learn the language, get along with people, and instead we were really. Weren't really worthy of empathy. We weren't really worthy of as people to interact with by our neighborhood, by our neighbors. And
example of your mother.
And so the example of my mother was when at some point I was standing in front of the door of my neighborhood, of my neighbor, and my neighbor suddenly slammed the garage door open and slammed me 2 meters across the road, and I fell on the floor, bruised my knee, and I was hurt. I was 10 years old by then, or 9 years old. And I looked up to him. I didn't understand. You know, I just fell. I thought he would come over to me. Instead, he was a large man. He just looked at me. He turned around, closed the door, and just walked off. And as I was there, as a kid, on the floor, I didn't understand why someone would hit me and walk away without any empathy, without acknowledging me at all. The next morning, I told my mom, and it was Wednesday, and my mom has, from a cultural perspective, she has this principle that before she ever considers going to Mecca, she needs to make sure that 7 neighbors on her left and 7 neighbors on her right are financially, economically stable. So any money that she has to spend, she will spend to her neighbors. And so what she did is every Wednesday she would make a really nice sweet rice dish. and she would distribute it to all the neighbors. And this was the next morning when I was hit by my neighbor. She gave it to me, she said, "Bring it to him, give it to him." So I walked up to the neighbor. He opened the door and I said, "This is something my mom made for you, please have it." And I just could see the confusion in his eyes. He's like, "But and he looked at me, this little kid with a new rice dish as a present to him. And I gave it to him and he was so confused, and in his confusion he just said thank you and closed the door and walked off. And we did this every Wednesday. I would just go around and just distribute those dishes. And at that point, we just noticed that people were starting to accept us and love us and talk to us and all of a sudden acknowledge us. And that's...
It's a lovely... Yeah.